Welcome. Thank you for joining again this CBRL webinar. My name is Carol Palmer and I'm the CBRL Director in Amman. It's a great pleasure to have you with us all today. For those of you who aren't familiar with CBRL, we're an independent UK research charity and membership organisation that exists to conduct, support and promote humanities and social sciences research on the Levant or Levantine Middle East. We're committed to independent academic scholarship and knowledge exchange of the region on which we focus. The CBRL is also part of the British Academy's one of the 8 international research institutes from whom we receive a grant to continue our operations, but we are always grateful to our members and friends whose donations enable us to support and do additional work, including offering funding opportunities to scholars. Just a little bit about the British International Research Institutes. We're mainly based in Europe, but also in Africa and in some Middle Eastern countries. CBRL actually is the 3rd oldest of the BIRIs. We were founded, our origin as the British School of Archaeology in 1919. We currently have an office in London and 2 institutes in the region. What's now often referred to as the Kenyan Institute in East Jerusalem, which is for about 20 years, the new name of the British School of Archaeology, and an institute in Amman, which was founded after 1967 in the 1970s. Both institutes operate as hubs for our community of scholars. We're working in the Levant and UK and globally. In normal times, we organise a regular programme of lectures in the UK and at our institutes, and we're very pleased to be able to bring you new versions of our events online at this time, a tradition that we hope will continue long into the future as well. We've been very pleased by the number of people who've been able to join us from around the world. I should say that, as I noticed, we were founded in 1919, so that is right at the beginning of the British Mandate, which is the subject of our lecture today. And in 2017, we held a number of events, both in Jerusalem and in the UK, about the Balfour Declaration. Those of you who are familiar with the region will very much know about the Balfour Declaration. And last year, in 2019, we also held a series of events in London. And I'm pleased to say that through those events, we got to know our 2 speakers today. Stephen Wagner was present in Jerusalem at one of the Balfour events. Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, okay. I thought I saw you in that video. And also Andrew Patrick, who's our discussant, our chair today, gave lectures and events around the King Crane Commission last May. And I should say, and we can follow this up with our, all those events are available either as podcasts or as videos, if you want to look into those events. And we're very aware as an organisation and as a British-based organisation of the role that Britain has played in the region, which is very familiar, of course, to anyone based in the Levant, but I'm sorry to say often not so familiar to those outside. And so we see these events that we're holding now and today's event as part of also self-exploration as well, and there's a lot of very good scholarship now on the mandate period. Events that we have held to this point have been very much around the end of the First World War and going into what happened with the peace and afterwards. But with this event, we're very much jumping into the first 20 years of the mandate itself. I think now I should move on to introduce our speakers and just give you some housekeeping rules on what will be happening today. Our speaker, Stephen Wagner, is a lecturer in international security at Brunel University London. His book, Statecraft by Stealth, Secret Intelligence and British Rule in Palestine, published by Cornell University Press last year, examines the relationship between intelligence policy and armed conflict in mandatory Palestine. He's going to say much more about it, so I will stop there. He is the recipient of a CBRL centenary grant and has been working on Hajj Amin Al-Husseini, and there's a short report on his work there in the CBRL bulletin that's also now available online, and this is a research line that he is continuing. Andrew Patrick, who is our chair and going to be our discussant, is an associate professor of history at Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee, in the USA. His research focuses on American involvement in the Middle East, particularly during the World War I era. And his publications include the book America's Forgotten Middle East Initiative, the King Crane Commission of 1919, published by IB Tauris in 2015. And his articles have also appeared in Middle East Studies, First World War Studies, and the Jerusalem Quarterly as well. His PhD he received from Manchester, and he's also taught in Turkey and Abu Dhabi as well. And he's also been the recipient of CBRL funding in the past. So both to both of you, thank you very much for being willing to talk today and to discuss this issue. How we've agreed the proceedings will follow is that Stephen will present a talk for about 20 minutes, sort of outlining his book and the key issues. And then for about another 20 minutes, Andrew will ask some questions and explore the book. And then it's your chance, our attendees, those in the Zoom room, using the Q&A can put in questions. We're not going to ask questions as the speakers are speaking, so we will be recording, making a note of your questions. Some of them we might answer in the background straight away. But for the last 20 minutes or so, it's an open forum for those who are in the Zoom room with us. I will normally say your name as a question, or Andrew we'll normally say your name, unless you say in your Q&A, I don't want to be mentioned. I don't want my name to be mentioned. So other than that, I think I'm going to hand over to the speakers, and I very much look forward to hearing the talk and hearing the discussion. And I'll join back in later on towards the end of the Q&A session with all of you. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Carol, for that introduction, and to Maggie and the CBRL as well for, first of all, the grant support, but also for organizing this. I'm going to share my presentation with you now. So that should come up clearly. And let's begin. What I really love about studying intelligence history is the ways in which it can change our understanding. So you can learn about intelligence because it's new and there's declassification, and it helps us really understand topics in a new way, but it also helps us understand decisions that were made, operations, etc., even if they're based on correct information or whether, or trying to understand why people get it wrong. It's super interesting to me. But I think the most significant thing is it really, in this case, helps us understand not just intelligence as a tool of administration, but the evidence produced by these previously unseen records actually sheds new light on the story of the early years of the Arab-Zionist conflict and Mandatory Palestine. So what I'm going to do is cover a number of key areas from the book, survey them, and we will move on to discussion from there. I realize not all of you may be intelligence experts, and likewise, some of you may come from that field and may know very little about the Palestine Mandate. So I'm going to frame the discussion with a bit of background now. What is intelligence? I define it very broadly in the book and also in general. Even when I'm teaching, I kind of frame it as intelligence is about keeping secrets, and it's about stealing secrets. Those are the two basic tasks, no matter how you want to characterize it. That covers about everything. I also use the term to refer to the institutions that do analysis. I refer to analysis as part of intelligence, and of course, secrets themselves. One thing I want to point out, and this is referring to the images here, is that Israel, the state of Israel, is bit unique. Actually, Russia does this too a bit, in that they tend, unlike, say, Britain, to commemorate their spies in a big way. And this is one of the levers of power that they use, is actually by, instead of keeping things secret forever and ever, they like to expose and shed light on some of their triumphs. So this postage stamp is of Sarah Aronson, and the photo and the street sign are of Angela Levi Bianchini, in both of whom I write about in the book. Now let's move on to colonial intelligence. Here's an area where things get a bit different than the rest of intelligence studies. I think the main difference is colonial security has a much bigger emphasis on censorship and propaganda than a security service might do in the metropole. Not that it doesn't exist there, it's just not as important. It's also worth pointing out that intelligence staff are actually running the government right up until 1928. So the people who conquer the country, the Allenby's intelligence staff in 1917, all take on these administrative posts in the military administration. When the civilian administration comes, they don't change their jobs, they just change their clothes. So that really helps us understand some of those early years. On top of that, you have Zionist intelligence cooperation underpinning Anglo-Zionist relations. And that's an important thing, which I'll elaborate on in a second. But another example that I might use to illustrate the importance of this kind of cooperation, the importance of censorship and propaganda, would be a subject in which our discussant, Andrew, is actually the world expert on. That's the King Crane Commission. And during 1919, during the Paris peace talks, a commission was sent to Palestine to check whether this mandate system was going to work out, whether the people actually wanted the British to come rule the country. And one of the things that the intelligence staff do is really crack down on nationalist expressions. They take away the Palestinian flags from meetings. They shut down clubs. They suppress publications. They work very, very hard to make sure everything appears like not just that the British are welcome, but that they're needed. So they even emphasize areas where Palestinians disagree and where maybe they're disagreeing violently. And there's many other things going on at the time, of course, but it works out. A little bit more on Mandatory Palestine. Everyone, I hope, should be familiar with Britain's three famous contradictory promises in the First World War to Arabs, to Britain's allies, especially France, and to the Zionists. What I want to focus on, though, is actually the terms of the British mandate. The mandate has two contradictory goals as a result of these promises. All League of Nations mandates require the mandatory power, in this case Britain, to prepare the country for independence, democratic government and independence. So that's goal number one. The contradictory one, and I'll explain why it's contradictory, is that they have to implement the Balfour Declaration of 1917, that is, to establish in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people, whatever that means. Now, by 1922, when the mandate takes legal effect, this is interpreted to mean to allow as much Jewish immigration as the country can absorb, and the Zionists actually get to define the data that determines absorptive capacity. And privately, many statesmen actually agree that the goal is to set up a Jewish majority and eventually a Jewish state. They tend to be reluctant to admit that publicly, and also they don't all agree on that goal, and many of them don't really understand Zionism's goals, by the way. Now, here's the contradiction. The Palestinian majority reject goal number two because, rightly, they feel like they're going to end up displaced in their own homes. This is a very rational response, if you ask me. Now, the British, in trying to fulfill goal number one, start to propose legislative councils, even parliaments that might be established in order to meet some of these League of Nations aims, these democratic self-government kind of institutions. The Palestinians won't participate in that because the British refuse to give these proposed bodies any control over immigration policy. So the British won't give democracy without a Zionist caveat, which means that they're unable to fulfill goal number one, and this is something that's frequently used against them in the League of Nations Permanent Mandates Commission. All right. Oh, by the way, one thing that's very helpful to the British is that they're able to prolong negotiations. They look at communications between Palestinians. Pictured here is the Palestinian delegation to London in 1921. They go there to communicate directly with the Colonial Secretary, Winston Churchill, after he ignores them during his own visit to the Middle East, and between them and their British supporters. So on the top right is Margaret Farquharson, who's part of a group of women, conservative ex-suffragettes who support the Palestinian case against the Zionist policy. And by reading their communications, they understand that actually we can produce more peace on the ground if we just let this go on. If we let them believe negotiations might lead to something, we're gonna enjoy more peace. It's an improvisation tactic, but actually this is the most they can get away with, and it works in the short run. I think it adds to everyone's frustration in the long run. The general arc of the mandate. The British think they can balance all these contradictory commitments, but they can't, and the Palestinians resist in a variety of ways, not just violently. However, it's those violent disturbances which get British attention, and after each one, there's some kind of recommendation to curb the Zionist policy, but this is either not adopted or backtracked. This is until the Palestinian Revolt, which breaks out the first time in 1936. It's renewed again the next year. Every attempt the British try to create a liberal civilian state and the police force are disrupted by the revolt. And they take these commitments very seriously, seeing them as, you know, the expansion of indigenous civil service and expansion of Palestinian police. But this is all disrupted by the revolt. So the answer to the deadlock by 1937 is partition. They're going to create a Jewish state. They're going to shrink the mandate to the Jerusalem-Jaffa corridor, and they're going to annex the rest of the country to Transjordan. Obviously, this makes no one happy. The revolt renews, and the next year it coincides with the Munich crisis. Now, 2 divisions, 20,000 troops are tied down in Palestine when they're actually possibly needed to fight Germany in Europe. So the British start to change their minds about the wisdom of the Zionist policy. And by 1939, with the white paper, which I'll speak about at the end, they finally give up on that policy. So let's talk about some of the spies, the fun stuff. Meet Joseph Davidescu, one of the most interesting characters I've come across in my research. I opened the book with a story of his career and his assassination in 1945. He's interesting to me because he seems like a wild man to me. He represents one of the core elements of the story of Anglo-Zionist intelligence cooperation and its limits. This cooperation, of course, underpins this quid pro quo. The Zionist intelligence supports British security and their power and their interests, and in exchange, the British support the Zionist policy, seeing also that it's part of their own interest. Davidescu is exceptional. He distrusts the Zionist institutions and their leaders. He is very much his own man. He's born to a family of refugees, but grew up in a more Zionistic environment than what they had arrived to. He basically, among other things, was a professional smuggler, using a livestock business as cover to travel across all these newly created borders. And he was very, very helpful to British intelligence. So he was busted by the French police in Lebanon for smuggling arms in 1929. And upon his release the next year, he was recruited into the British Security Service, where he remained until his death. Now, he's often portrayed in Hebrew as a kind of double agent, passing information also about the British to the Zionists. I'd rather characterize him as an independent, trying to look out for his own community and what he sees as its interests. But you can see also how good he was as a spy. This photo on the top right is another angle of a much more famous photo of the Palestinian rebel leadership in 1936. So second from the left is Fawzi al-Kawukji, who led a volunteer army of 300, which tied down 2 British divisions in Palestine in the summer of 1936. Next to him is Fakhri Abdul Hadi, who worked with the rebels in 1936, and 2 years later, British intelligence managed to turn him against them, and they created all this psychological damage and by turning Palestinians against Palestinians, sowing discord in the ranks. And I'll talk more about that ahead. So you can see that how close he got to what was seen by him and his employers as the enemy camp. But his death, he was assassinated by the Stern gang, and most people in his hometown actually believe it's future Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir was the one who pulled the trigger. Shamir never really admitted that, but he also always defended the assassination. To me, his life and death represent the story of Anglo-Zionist intelligence cooperation. First, it matters. It's core to British power and British security, their access to all this kind of information. But eventually, once there's a break in Anglo-Zionist relations, suddenly, when your job in security is to turn in Jewish terrorists, this position you've been maintaining is untenable, as are Anglo-Zionist relations, as the other side, right? The Jewish community of Palestine turns to revolt. The other big character I want to talk about is Hajj Amin Al-Husseini, fascinating person, probably the most important Palestinian leader of this period. And as you heard, I'm working on a new project based on his World War II era papers. But the main question from an intelligence point of view is this guy, from the British point of view, a friend or foe? Do we trust him? Is he working with us and according to our interests, or actually is he working against our interests secretly? And you see these debates, which also play out in historiography. Historians debate this issue, and so did the intelligence services. So the police were sure he was cooperative, and the military intelligence was sure he was secretly supporting the rebels. And the radical nationalists. The extent to which he influenced or even led the revolt in its early phases is also up for debate, and these are all issues I talk about in the book. But as a piece of intelligence history, he's very puzzling and very interesting, and I took a pretty firm position in the book, using all the evidence I could dig up on him about his relationship with the radical youth, with kind of more violent streams of nationalism, his tendency to assassinate his opponents, his Palestinian opponents, that is, and of course his emphasis on security, secrecy, and actually there's a lot more to say about his own intelligence work. But the big kind of headline issue in the book that I deal with, of course, is the revolt. Pictured on the top there is Dudley Clark. Now, he may not be famous to you if you're not a military historian, but those of us who are would recognize him as being the guy who first figured out how to deceive the Germans during the Second World War. Highly decorated by both the British and actually the Americans, getting a medal as well for that kind of work. But he's also central to the planning the counter-revolt in Palestine. He is the one coordinating intelligence with operations. So always, for the historians out there, always check the files named miscellaneous, because I found the best stuff and it's all about him there. All these planning and staff papers and intelligence reports, all with his signature at the bottom. And you can see how influential he was in shaping the counter-revolt. He authorized plans to sow discord in the rebel camp. He is the one who, with Davidescu actually, who organized the flipping of Fakhri Abdul Hadi. He is also helped organize the construction of roads, fences, fortifications throughout the country, which we could talk about in Q&A, which totally transformed the country. He helped bring the army to the Palestinian hinterland, helped reinforce the system of detention and internment without habeas corpus, of course, which helped cleave the rebels away from the civilian population. Very brutal, very effective, not very nice, and definitely changed the way I saw this guy. Like when I first learned about him in like military history seminars, it seems, you know, interesting and dynamic and heroic even. And this study has really definitely affected the way I view his and other cases. And now probably the biggest revision I offer in the book to the typical narrative of Mandatory Palestine is that of the origins of the 1939 White Paper policy. So let's quickly cover what it was. The White Paper is issued in May 1939. It restricts Jewish immigration to about 1,500 a month. The British, as I mentioned, decide we can't do this dual commitment anymore. Let's say the Balfour Declaration has been fulfilled. There is a Jewish national home. We don't have to allow any more Jews in mass numbers. Bad timing, by the way, from the Jewish point of view, for the Zionist one. So they restrict immigration to 1,500 a month for 5 years. And this policy is going to be handed to a new single federal state of Palestine and its government. And there's a timetable to full de jure independence as well within 10 years. Now, how is this possible? It's because of British access to Saudi and other Arab state communications. This really helps us understand this big change of policy. And when you compare intercepted communications with the policy papers, you suddenly see why minds are changing. So this is an example of one I've posted here. On the right, you can see a very helpful headline, a serial number. You see the date that the document was prepared. You see within the document a kind of summary of the, in English, of the Arabic wireless telegram that was sent. And you can see also how that, unlike other ones which were translated and prepared in Palestine, this was sent back to London for translation. So they're bringing in extra help on this issue. So you learn a lot about kind of how priorities work, right? When you look at the turnaround time between October 2nd and October 6th, 1936, you have a message prepared. That's relatively quick for that period. Normally turnaround was about 2 weeks for Arabic material. On bottom left, you see everyone who got a copy of this. Also very helpful in proving actually where this shows influence and where it may not. So what is Ibn Saud, the founding king of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz Ibn Saud, what does he have to do with the Palestine problem? So he first really starts to matter during the 1936, the first phase of the revolt, when he is asked by the British to help end it he personally calls on the Mufti of Jerusalem to bring an end to the general strike and the revolt. His opinion on Palestine matters to the British because he's influential. That incident proves he's influential. When the partition plan comes out, he's really angry that his more powerful neighbor to the north, at the time Abdullah was more powerful, is going to be strengthened even further by this annexation. But above all, the British know he's trustworthy, that he doesn't lie to them, that he'll follow up on the things he says he's going to do, and that's because they're reading his messages. So the British decide that they're going to hold a conference in early 1939. Who do they invite? They invite the Zionists as usual, but now they also invite the independent Arab states, including Saudi Arabia. They allow an informal Palestinian delegation to come. The Mufti is excluded at the Saudi requests. They ask the King of Saudi Arabia, should he come? He says no, he doesn't like him. Now they're reading all the delegation's communications. The British therefore can pull the strings from behind the scenes. They ask, when the conference inevitably fails, right? The Zionists and Arabs are not going to agree on a solution. They expect this. They ask the Saudis to come up with a solution on their own with the other Arab states, excluding the Zionists. So they come up with several drafts. The Palestinians won't agree with it because it doesn't guarantee the amnesty for the Mufti, who's been held responsible for leading the revolt. It won't guarantee him or his comrades specific jobs. The Saudi king threatens the Palestinians, says, if you don't accept this draft, then I can't help you vis-a-vis the British. And that's kind of the end of the story from that point of view. The British are reading all of this, and that means they know that there's no point waiting for the Palestinians to accept, and therefore they pull the plug, they use the latest Saudi draft, and boom, a huge change in policy, a huge, huge watershed. So this has a big impact, of course, by producing an Anglo-Zionist conflict, right? But it also secures some British interests. What they want is a benevolent neutral. They know there's going to be a new war in Europe, that there's going to be a world war, and they want Saudi Arabia. They see Saudi Arabia and Turkey as the two reliable Middle Eastern benevolent neutrals, right, partners. They also get his influence in the Pan-Arab movement, for what it's worth. And of course, Ibn Saud gets all the prestige of securing the first concession on Zionism from the British, and it costs him about nothing. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Andrew, and we'll begin our discussion. And I thank you again all for your attention and for hanging in there with me.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wagner. And of course, thanks to CBRL and specifically to Maggie McNulty and Carol Palmer for having me back at a CBRL event, and for the funding once upon a time in the early days of my PhD. And so congratulations on the book, Dr. Wagner. It's, I think one of the book's main strengths is the dispassionate and thorough nature of its analysis. The conclusions you come to are rooted firmly in the sources, and they show no pre-existing notions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which, you know, so many books on the topic sometimes do. I think Dr. Wagner clearly shows that, at least where intelligence was concerned, the British and the Zionists were in a symbiotic relationship in Mandate Palestine, leaving the Palestinians at a major disadvantage. I think it's essential reading for scholars of Mandate Palestine. But also for anyone hoping to gain new insight into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the origins of it. Okay, to the questions, which I have written out here. The first question goes back to sort of the beginning of the book, and a major revisionist claim you make is that British intelligence officers did not see the contradictions in their wartime agreements until later in 1919. And you've mentioned these agreements. It is true, you know, as you note, that these were all poorly thought through acts of desperation designed to win a war. Yet prominent Brits like Lord Curzon, Edward Montagu, Gertrude Bell, and others were arguing in 1917 that the Balfour Declaration was unworkable and would be resisted. Gilbert Clayton, head of intelligence in Egypt, doubted the wisdom of it, but was convinced later by Chaim Weizmann. And in June of 1919, when the King-Crane Commission shows up, one of the first things the British troops say to them is that Zionist policy is going to be resisted. Now, I know you argue in the book that British intelligence was very immature in these early days. But it would seem that an intelligence official would need to be exceedingly obtuse not to understand the problems that Zionism would cause in Palestine. So my question to you for this is, how could the British officials have not comprehended this right away?
Sure. So first of all, some people were obtuse about it. To her credit, Gertrude Bell is really the only voice in the intelligence circles anyway to like stick to her guns on opposition to the Zionist policy. When people are willing to accept it, it's often because they're not sure what this actually means as a commitment, and most of them are easily reassured by Weizmann himself. But what I mean and what I'm trying to do in the book, and maybe this will be helpful if I show illustrative map, is the British see it first and foremost when it's issued. Afterwards, things change very rapidly, right? But when it's issued, they see it as a wartime instrument. This is a kind of, not just an act of desperation, but an act of desperation by the side that's sure it's about to lose the war. So this map is what I have a version of this in the book, but the color version's a lot better. It's based on German data, by the way, but it's meant to kind of, this was the Allies' answer to Wilson's peace overtures in 1916. And what they're basically saying is, until all these minority groups are free to run their own affairs, have their self-determination, the conflict won't be over, even if we agree to a temporary peace deal. The other piece of context that's important to keep in mind is everyone expects all the belligerent powers are going to survive the war. Now, by the time the Balfour Declaration is issued, it's pretty clear Russia's out, and that actually helps spur things along with the Zionist policy. But within a year, the German Empire no longer exists, the Russian Empire no longer exists, Austria-Hungary no longer exists, Ottoman Empire shrunk into a shell of its former self, right? Suddenly, these bargaining chips with small nations that you've been trying to accrue with this kind of propaganda, now you have to answer to them, and you don't have to answer to the people you were fighting for 4 years. So when I say that the intelligence officers don't really get the contradiction, it's because it's really not until the end of the war, those last 100 days, that they start to see that, oh, we're going to have to sort this out with the Zionists. We're going to have to sort this out with the Arabs. We actually have to figure out what they mean by all this. And that's when you see, so you're right, by summer 1919, actually, the intelligence staff have a pretty good idea of what it's going to take, and that's a lot of force to enforce the Zionist policy. T.E. Lawrence himself, by the way, says to the government within, I think 2 years later, if you can't find a constitutional solution, you better just arm the Jews, because that's what it's going to take.
Yeah, it's interesting, because I often feel like what more is there to say about these wartime agreements, right? Mm-hmm. And your book managed to say something more about these wartime agreements and something different, which I appreciated. Let's see, we could talk a little more about the Arab Revolt, I think, which is, as you said, a real major focus of the book. And I think you explain this revolt very well. And in your complex telling, it seems like we could view this as an early Zionist-Palestinian battle or a revolution, as some of them did view it as some Palestinians did view it as, an insurrection, a Palestinian civil war, which is maybe not out there as much as, at least in the more cursory coverage in history books of the revolt, that you miss these peace bands and these Palestinians who are trying to defend their villages from other Palestinian rebels. But also you bring in, and you talked about this with Ibn Saud a little bit, that it was a major event that shaped the international relations of the Middle East's fledgling countries. You know, Iraq and Jordan and Saudi Arabia were all playing a role here, or at least attempting to play a role. So, and you talk about this a bit, you've talked about intelligence a little bit, but there's also elements of colonial policing that you discuss in the book too. And you know, there's some pretty harsh policing going on in the United States right now. So is there any sort of line to be drawn between the two?
Yeah, actually, and I can include a kind of personal anecdote, but basically about a little more than 10 years ago, I first started to look at all these colonial policing records from Palestine. So around 1930, the big reforms are brought in. They want to civilianize the police. They'd been kind of based on Irish gendarmeries, and they wanted to recruit more Palestinians and more Jews. They wanted to have more educated detectives and fewer illiterate constables, their words. They wanted smart police. They wanted what we today call community policing. They thought this would be one of these elements of kind of liberal democratic life, and that goal number one of the mandate. Because during the revolt, the police collapsed, and the army kind of takes control of the police and militarizes it. And what you see are very explicit discussions. We need more illiterate constables, their words. We need, so dumb, brutish kind of types, right? We need to give them rifles. They should not wear blue anymore in the field. They should be wearing tan, like military colors. They should, or khaki. They should be part of our show of force. So I'm reading this at the time that my police, my hometown police in Calgary, had just switched from blue squad cars to black, with much more intimidating appearances, again, seeing more heavy arms. Obviously, all those reports about police forces in America buying military surplus were coming out at the time, and I'm thinking, is this the purpose of police? Like, I'm sorry, what goal is this serving? Are they here to intimidate us? So this helped me understand not just a contemporary idea about militarized policing, but also the importance of decolonization in general. I mean, the fact that this is happening in North America, to me, is part of the colonial inheritance. This is a natural result of the kinds of countries I used to live in, and which you still do. And it's really not until then that I understood what that movement was about, to my shame, I guess. But then comparing that against some of the other records, like Israel has the same legacy. The Israeli border police shoulder patch logo is of a Tegart fortress. So, I mean, it is inherently, any frontier force is inherently a colonial force. So they also have this kind of colonial inheritance. What does it have to do with intelligence? I mean, everything is, those are the staff that are making these decisions, actually. So again, like it really gives me great pause, wondering why we have to police ourselves in this way, why we can't follow this kind of unarmed. I mean, I'm not saying the British police are perfect, far from it, but like starting with unarmed street constables sounds like a good idea generally, you know? Yeah,
interesting. All right, I want to get in a couple more questions here, and then we can go to audience questions. But you talked about the white paper, 1939, and I think you make a very interesting point about it that didn't come out in your presentation. And you argue in the book that, of course, Zionists saw this as a betrayal, and you know this is a very understandable reaction. But you argue, though, that in one sense, the white paper of 1939 was a gift to the Zionists. Could you explain this apparent contradiction to the audience?
So I agonized over that line because I knew what it implied. And it was actually suggested to me by a friend, by John Ferris, and it took me forever to just include it, because he was right. Now, what I don't mean that the white paper and the Jewish lives that it cost were a fair price for Israeli independence. That is not at all what I mean there. What I am saying, though, is that without it, there'd be no discovery, no realization on the Zionist side. They might be ready to fight for those things. They might actually have the stately instruments of power that they're inheriting from the British, and might be able to use them against them. And that's my point, is that Ben Gurion decides around 1941-42 that statehood as soon as possible is the way to go. And actually, it's counterfactual, but I don't think he could have come to this conclusion unless he'd been left on his own, unless the Zionists had been left on their own at that moment. But with all this experience they got from 20 years of working very closely with the British.
Yeah, it was sort of following on from that too. Another thing that you brought out in the book that didn't come out in your talk, and I think is a major research finding, was that so the British built all these fortifications around the time of the revolt and all this security infrastructure and such, and that helped them to put down the revolt. Mm-hmm. But you also argue that it helped the Zionist/Israeli forces defeat the Palestinians. Yep. In the 1947-1949 war, as well as the Arabs, of course. Would you like to expand on that for the audience? Because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and also give you a peek at the original maps I used. The ones in the book are based on these. So here's the one in the book. You can see kind of British infrastructure built between 1937 and 43 or so, right? All the fortresses, converted frontier posts. So they're all like these big Taggart towers and big block buildings, and the roads that were built. Now, the first phase of the 1947-48, like the Civil War phase of that war, is often referred to as the War of the Roads, especially in Israeli historiography. You could easily call it the War of the Taggarts. No, if you look at where the major clashes are taking place, it's all over this relatively freshly built British infrastructure. And when I first saw it, in my mind, realizing, oh my goodness, this basically predestined the course of the first Arab-Israeli war. And that's what they're fighting over, are those choke points, those hard points. And the Israelis, largely speaking, get most of them in their partition in 1947. And they fight for the ones that they don't get. And often they're successful. There's two big exceptions, of course, famously, Latrun, less famously in Tulkarm. But you can see some of the original maps. So here's an example of like the state of construction at the peak of the rebellion. You can see the kind of deployment of British forces across the country, and the reason why they decide to build all these new roads. So they can't really access some of the hillier areas, say southeast of Haifa or near Jenin, Nablus, etc., or certainly in the north. So this was kind of their answer, was just to throw money and concrete at it and asphalt. And it worked out for the army, it worked out for the Israelis, and it totally scarred the landscape and devastated Palestinian chances of any military defense, if you ask me.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to maybe some questions that are coming in from the audience. And we'll start with one from Sarah Irving. And the question is this: you referred to Hajj Amin Al-Husseini's tendency to assassinate Palestinian political opponents. Do we have a sense of how many people he actually had assassinated and who carried out the killings for him?
Right. So thank you. It's a very helpful question. This is something I'm still working on, and it's also something I address in the book, although I can be more elaborate here. So his cousin, confidant, and kind of right-hand man, Jamal, long after these events, admitted that they probably were behind about 40 assassinations that he could think of. Some Israeli historians put it up in the thousands. Others, like Hillel Cohen, said it's probably under 1,000. And it really, Charles Anderson, and in his dissertation, actually really unpacks this, and it's very reliable research. And I find it helpful in the sense that you have to parse like the moments where he says, kill this guy, and then someone goes and does it, versus the ones where kind of the things he says, either through incitement or hints, or even just not using the usual channels, kind of indicates to his devotees who needs a threatening letter, who needs to go. So they have a lot of autonomy, and during the revolt, actually there's groups doing this. They don't need central authority to kill each other. So very gruesome, obviously. So my inclination now is to go with the low numbers, right, in the dozens, because if his right-hand man says so, it's good enough for me. It's enough murders to still see someone is a pretty bad guy. Yeah, and that's without his wartime record. Now, how does he do it? There's different means. He refers to a kind of loosely organized apparatus around himself called al-Wafa, right, like the loyalty. And at different times, his followers use different names for this, including the Black Hand. Izzeddin al-Qassam's followers go with the Green Hand. Qassam is an employee of one of the national bodies that Hajj Amin controls. So the links are all there. Does it prove that he says, Qassam, have this guy killed? Sure, thing, boss. And then he goes and sends someone? No. But you have to kind of look, in my view, it's important to look at the net picture and the broad patterns of how this all works. And the other thing that's coming out is his use of Pan-Islamic Congress money, which the British had no say over. And he used it to employ more staff at the Haram al-Sharif, especially bodyguards. So looking through his ledgers, looking through SMC ledgers, you can see people listed as bodyguards, and often assume, and especially if they work under certain people who I know organized assassinations, you can safely assume that they're part of this apparatus, actually. So this is going on. And by the way, before he passed away last year, Sami Hamoudi was working on this very question, and I'm not sure what his family intends to do with the research, but it's a very interesting problem. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, well, there's a question that sort of follows on from that, and this is from Roberto Mazza, who we know well. Hi, Roberto. It says, he writes, first Ottoman intelligence, then British, Zionist, and lastly Israeli. It seems the Palestinians were never able to create their own apparatus. Is this a fair statement? And secondly, do you see continuities in the policing implanted in Palestine from Ottoman times? And if so, how does this impact the Palestinians in Palestine?
So in the first point, I have more to say, but basically you have two problems here. One is the lack of central bureaucratic Palestinian archive, right? The archives are plundered, dispersed, destroyed, and it's very hard to build this kind of picture for that side of the story. And I hope research figures this out, certainly during my career. And I will do my best to help. But putting the picture together as best we can. So you have, on the one hand, you have Hajj Amin's security apparatus, which I mentioned. The other, I have actually, and I'm working now, thanks to grant money from CBRL, I'm working on a new article about this forgery incident from 1935 that actually shows a pretty elaborate system of espionage with among the Palestinians. They're able to, so Shakib Arslan, who's not Palestinian, but he's a prominent pan-Islamist, is able to name the head of British intelligence who is trying to slander him. So he knows him by name. So what does that say? The guy whose job is it to keep and steal secrets actually has this very fundamental thing out there about him, and he had to have gotten that somehow, right? The other one is you can see Palestinian opposition parties, right? The Nashashibi parties, they're able to go and steal letters and copy them, or like remember the gist of it, and they do this kind of activity as well. Remind me the second part of the question.
He asks, do you see continuities between the policing implanted in Palestine from Ottoman times?
So there's a tendency in historiography to remark about how both Palestinians and Zionists referred to the effectiveness of brutal Ottoman policing. And I don't know enough about it, but my sense is it's probably mostly rubbish. That actually there was a kind of effective justice system most of the time, and that the idea that some kind of thugs on horseback could go knock some heads together and make it all work is probably ridiculous. But I'm willing to be proven wrong. But
okay. Okay, a few more questions from the audience. There's a bunch coming in. Penelope Quinton asks, did you find anything surprising from the usual narrative role of Philby in the mandatory and Ibn Saud relations? Did you find anything surprising from the, oh, sorry, that was a repeat. That's the question.
So on Sinjin Philby, so very interesting person, obviously, the father of the famous Soviet mole, Kim Philby, strange family. Anyway, Philby's deeply involved in some of these negotiations in the 20s, the ones that kind of like help keep the peace but are not that sincere from the British point of view. But he is interested in, again, in propping up Ibn Saud and his kind of regional leadership. Now, it's important when I say that to remember that the Hashemites were not the obvious candidates for leading a kind of pan-Arab federation. Even before the war, the Saudis were seen as the likely candidate in the Ottoman context, right? Their military victories and their, not just against the Ottomans, but against their kind of local hereditary opponents, were held up as kind of a promise of kind of new order coming out of the peninsula. So for people who supported the idea of maybe a dual kingdom, right, Arab-Turkish kingdom, this was very promising at the time. And Philby, still kind of favoring British interests, actually thought it was a good idea to run with that. So,
all right. Let's see, another question here, and this is from Julio Moreno. You mentioned that the mandate was ruled by intelligence until 1928, when the police were reformed, or a bit later civilianized. What is the relationship between intelligence and police, British, Arabic, Jewish section from that moment on?
So the police are kind of, they're understaffed, skeleton structure, 1928-29, this big, it's a revolt. Actually, Palestinian historiography calls it the Barak Revolt, and I think we all ought to stop using the colonial language of disturbances and actually treat the intentions seriously. But the relationship between intelligence and police until then depends on the topic. So the police are leading the charge against communist invasion in the early 20s, and they work very effectively with Zionists at eliminating communist, like Bolshevik communist penetration. They deport the people who they legally can, blacklist the others in this context of the Red Scare. So Zionists proved their partnership in other topics pretty early on. Afterwards, the relationship between police and intelligence is kind of dodgy. So, of course, the police have their own intelligence service called the Criminal Investigation Department. It's not just a forensic unit, although they have those facilities. This is actually a kind of political police, right? It's a secret police. And that's kind of part of colonial policing anywhere in the British Empire. Actually, there's some version of this wherever you go. The police relationship with other intelligence services, again, depends on the topic. On the Mufti, they actually are at each other's throats. On things like Zionist arms smuggling, illegal Jewish immigration, actually they're pretty cooperative. So just depends.
Okay. Yeah, and I would ask that member of the audience that is all traced very well in the book. So this is put in another plug for the book there. All right, and another question here from Philip Edwards. He writes, British intelligence presumably had good intelligence on Abdullah of Jordan leading up to the War of 1948, and Abdullah plays a big role in the book. What did the Brits know or do about the suspected arrangement of a ceasefire line between Abdullah and the Zionists, and did the arrangement serve Britain's purpose?
So I'm not an expert on that topic, and I'm not sure, and it's been over a decade since I've looked at, like very seriously anyway, at post-1945 material that doesn't have to do with the Mufti. The only thing I can say is until and during the early years of the Second World War, the British intelligence in one form or another is kind of his personal security service. They're pretty good at that. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another question came in from Tawfiq Haddad, who's the director of the Kenyan Institute in Jerusalem. And he writes that it's a two-part question. The UK came to be known as perfidious Albion, quotes, for its unscrupulous duplicity in international relations and foreign policy. Your research seems to underline the moniker par excellence. What does your research tell us about the Palestine-specific contributions to this moniker and any particular innovations they developed in this theater?
Well, thanks for the question. So it's a complicated one. Obviously, this is a label the French like to throw at the British whenever they can, especially de Gaulle, who can be a bit Anglophobic at times. However, do British policymakers behave treacherously? At times, yeah. I think the big famous incidents, though, like the First World War stuff, actually, my tendency is to say there's a lot more accident going on here than, like, you know, twizzling the evil mustache as they plot to bring the Zionists to Palestine and kick out Palestinians. I think it's far more complicated a process than that. But in their direct dealings with Palestinians, I think they can be duplicitous. So the big one for me is reading their messages and using that information to lead them in the wrong direction in diplomatic negotiations. I think that if that were exposed at the time, it would be a massive scandal. People would resign. This was still, despite everything that had changed in like the social norms of the British gentry, would still be seen as ungentlemanly at that time. So it would have been pretty scandalous. So that's an example, judging them by their own standards. Yeah.
All right, let me get to the second part of the question. Can you elaborate, and also Tawfiq Haddad, can you elaborate on what your research says about how British spies cultivated and manipulated the Palestinians / Arab leadership more?
It depends kind of where and what we're talking about. So if we're looking at the government's relationship with the Mufti, of course, there would be, Hajj Amin would not have that job without a kind of irregular appointment by the British. He was unqualified. He didn't finish university. I don't even know if he had a high school diploma. I haven't found any evidence of that. So totally unqualified for kind of the chief jurisprudential arbiter in Jerusalem, right? So he's an imposition, and so are the other offices that he got. It doesn't mean he's not a good nationalist and he's not looking out for the national interest. In fact, I think his care for the national interest was the reason why he had such a broad base of support. In terms of other leaders, the British, after a lot of reluctance, get involved with the Defense Party, Hizb al-Difa, beginning in 1935-ish. When they worked together to slander Hajj Amin and Shakib Arslan. And this is kind of the beginning of a relationship where kind of the vanquished party is working closely with the government, basically to get back at Hajj Amin. But yeah.
All right. Okay, we have a bunch more questions coming in. We'll get through as many as we can. This is from Peter Wallace. This question is, did the U.S. share intelligence with the U.S. and was this passed to the Zionists? And if I could add to that, like with, of course, the French as well, sitting just to their north in
the British share intelligence with Americans?
Yeah.
The French. Okay. So yeah, actually, one of the kind of common narratives about British Empire is their hostility to the French, especially in this region. And all I found was evidence of cooperation. Doesn't mean they always trust or like each other, but actually, when they have questions for each other, they get answers to honest answers to queries, generally speaking. Doesn't mean there's not a rivalry. Doesn't mean they don't really get at each other's throats during and just after the Second World War. But in the end, the broad pattern, I think, is cooperative until the French are kicked out. With the Americans, it depends on the topic. So the American consulate is actually a great source of information, of like impartial information about what's going on, because they're talking to everybody, including Zionist dissidents. So one of the most interesting things I found was evidence of Chaim Kalvarisky, who I mentioned in the book several times. He was an old intelligence hand for the Zionists, actually offered to pass a Jewish agency code book to the British via the Americans. And at a very critical time. The British share any wartime kind of material with the Americans. The American consulate is also willing to act as a courier for the Zionists. So they'll use a diplomatic bag so that Zionists can send messages to their offices in Istanbul, for example, without the British seeing them. So there's kind of more to be told about the dynamics of that relationship. Yeah. All
right. Let's see. Let's get to one here on Zoom, and I apologize for pronunciation here. Aliasgar Barmal asks, so do you think that British decolonization plays into the hands of the Palestine-Israeli conflict, like India and Pakistan, in that sense? Because the Israelis got the resources from the British to win the major wars, such as in 1941, leaving the Palestinians vulnerable and not able to advance. So without these resources and intelligence, the Zionists would not have been able to achieve what they were able to in terms of resources, military and lands. Right. Would you agree with that assertion?
Generally, yeah. I mean, without this kind of secret cooperation, yeah. I mean, this is the Zionist secret weapon. Layla Parsons' book on Fazil Koukji illustrates this perfectly in the chapter on the 1948 war. Sorry, right? The scene where the Zionists the Palestinian commander realizes in his reports to Koukji that their codes are being cracked by the Zionists, and that he can't communicate with him, and he's kind of gone silent in the middle of a battle. This totally shows the disparity in capability between the two sides. This is a very important skill that the Zionists could learn from volunteering in the British Army as their own unit, and passing and disseminating that information internally. The cutting edge in tactics actually is something the Palestinians wake up to in the middle of the war, which is too late,
Okay, I've been told we have time for 2 more questions. The first comes from Dr. Salman Abu Sitta, and he makes a statement that you will agree with or disagree with. Britain decimated Palestinian society 1936 to 1939, he notes. Therefore, 1939 is the British inflicted Nakba. Do you agree?
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, just looking at, my next project is going to deal with this a lot more, but the British set up a system of detention, again, without habeas corpus, that totally destroys any possibility of Palestinian self-government. Because for one thing, it turns Palestinians against one another. It turns their personal interest against the national interest. So people are like elites in particular who are sitting in open air prisons are basically offered the following: you can come join the government, join our jobocracy, as the British privately called it, and get out of here, or you can sit here for the sake of the national interest. And a lot of people do what makes sense for their families and give up. Matthew Hughes, my colleague at Brunel, has also a book on the revolt, described in brutal detail the price Palestinians pay for the army's repression. So there's no skirting around it. And yeah, I think Salman, that's a very fair statement.
Okay, yeah, another question, let's see, coming in here, Martin Jarrett. And this is something I think you go into your book a lot. He says, in other parts of the British Empire, such as Aden, there was a lack of coordinated intelligence and suffered a multiplication of intelligence organization that didn't coordinate well. How was this avoided in Palestine?
It wasn't.
Yeah.
So that's the short answer, is that it wasn't. They solved the problem during the revolt because it's a crisis. Here's one of those things where my mind was changed a lot. British intelligence staff, military intelligence staff, start coordinating between services, which was unusual at the time. To have RAF and army officers and officers from the Navy kind of work together in the same room, in the same staff, on the same problems was unusual, but it was considered by people in the Second World War as the model for how to fight the war. So they refer to this experiment in Palestine as being the way to do things the right way, especially in the Middle East, because Wavell goes from GOC Palestine to Commander-in-Chief Middle East during the war, right? And in that sense, you see some solutions to this kind of problem of coordinating intelligence. But again, the price that Palestinians pay is rather severe, actually. Because again, these are the people who authorize all the fortress construction, fences, roads, and yeah.
All right. Well, let me take my my prerogative as chair to ask one wrap-up question. And now when I teach Mandate Palestine, I usually teach it as part of a modern Middle Eastern history class, and I get to talk about it in maybe one class. And I talk about it in the sense that the British were sort of creating, or they were a referee in a situation that was impossible, that they had partly created themselves. And that's the grander narrative. But these are the contradiction that you talk about in the book. Based on your book and your research, what should I add to my one day of Mandate Palestine class? What would you push me to make sure is in there when I'm talking about this in a more big picture way?
The biggest big picture thing I would suggest is including something about Saudi influence over the white paper, because it's not just a big revision of the story of the Mandate, but also like Middle Eastern history, history of the British Empire, history of the Second World War, diplomatic history, right? We still in diplomatic history don't tend to consult diplomatic intelligence, even though it's so good. You have like a full account of Arab state diplomacy that no one uses. So I would definitely emphasize that point, especially because also the price European Jews pay for the white paper, I think, confounds a lot of people, and did need for a long time. So,
all right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Carol Palmer here, but thank you so much, Dr. Wagner, and thank you to our audience. Great questions, really.
Thank you so much.
Erudite, sort of and I apologize we couldn't get to everyone's questions.
Okay, so thank you very much, both of you, for a great presentation and great questions both from Andrew and from our audience. We know there were a lot more coming in. We're sorry we couldn't get to them all. There's a lot of excellent scholarship coming out on the Mandate, and CBRL has been running some events. I mentioned them. Those who are in the Zoom, we will send you some of the links to some of those podcasts and YouTube so that you can see them there. What I would also like to mention is CBRL's journal Contemporary Levant published a special issue last year on the mandate, the British mandate in Palestine, new histories, new historical agents, and reframing old paradigms, including some articles by some very familiar people who've been both in our audience and Andrew is interviewed there as well. We're arranging for that to be open access for a while during the summer, so we'll also make that available. And just to, yes, thank you everybody. Thanks to our speakers again. And thank you for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed the event. Please do look at our website for future webinars on the Levant. A wide range of lectures that are available. We've got another couple coming up in June as well. So what I would also like to say is please support us by either joining our mailing list or becoming a member as well. We're a membership society too. And stay in touch. So thank you very much all once again, and bye for this evening from Amman. Ma salama.